The mystery of the missing campers has fascinated people all over the world. The circumstances surrounding their disappearance were so bizarre that it has been discussed in Congress and even inspired a podcast. But what if there was more to this case than met the eye? What if there was lost footage from the night they disappeared? She had watched them drive up to the campground earlier that summer evening, but when she went out for her evening rounds, she discovered that their tent was empty and their car was gone. Investigators combed through every inch of it, but they never found anything out of the ordinary. As the years passed, the case went cold and the memories of the missing men faded from the public consciousness. But the truth is stranger than fiction. Their campfire was still burning and their supplies were untouched. It appeared as though they had simply vanished into thin air. It detailed not only the strange facts surrounding the case, but also connected it to a series of other unsolved mysteries. In fact, it gets even stranger. One of the men had a brother who never gave up hope of finding out what happened to his sibling. One man, Eugene Buckwalker, had been seen arguing with the men the night before they disappeared. He couldn't describe the car or recall its license plate number, but it stuck out to him because of how slowly it was driving. At the time, investigators assumed it was a random occurrence, but in hindsight, it could have been related to the camper's disappearance. He claimed that after the argument, he returned to his campsite and didn't come out until 2 days later. If they had only been able to hike a few more miles, they would have come across a ranger station. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to learn more about similar cases, stay tuned for more content. Thank you for watching, and stay safe. But unfortunately, they never made it that far. They were found, but not in the way they or their families had hoped. And maybe that's the saddest part of all. He said he had no part in the camper's disappearance and an alibi to back up his story. However, many people at the campground that night claimed they saw him walking alone down the road around 2 a.m., just hours before the men were reported missing. He was carrying something that looked like a large sack slung over his shoulder. When questioned, he said he had taken a midnight snack to his friend's campsite, but this was later disproven. His friend claimed he had spent the entire night at his own campsite, and no one else saw him leave. While his alibi may have been airtight, this doesn't necessarily mean he was innocent. He could have easily fabricated the whole thing. After all these years, he finally got his answers, but it wasn't the closure he was hoping for. To find out why, let's take a look at the evidence. In 1971, a year after the men disappeared, their tent was found on the side of a road. And thanks to the work of podcasters and investigators, we now know what really happened to the campers. The trio stumbled upon something in the woods that they weren't supposed to. Whatever it was, it scared them enough that they tried to flee the area. Unfortunately, they encountered someone who was just as dangerous as whatever it was they had seen, and that person wanted to keep them quiet. The fact that their bodies were never found suggests that their killer took great care to dispose of them. He may have even gone so far as to dismember their bodies and feed them to animals. This would explain why their car was left at the campground and their tent on the side of the road. It was almost as if they had vanished into thin air. It was dirty and torn, but otherwise intact. This would seem to indicate that the men had left it behind when they left the campground, which makes it unlikely that they were kidnapped or taken against their will. Whoever took them must have carried their tent with them and then abandoned it when they were finished with it. While this could be explained away as coincidence, it adds a level of suspicion to whoever was responsible for the crime. The podcasters argued that the 3 men hadn't disappeared at all, but rather had been murdered by a serial killer named Alan Black. This theory was later confirmed when a hiker found human remains in a nearby state park. They, too, assumed they were just playing on animal noises and went back to sleep. The next morning when Cheryl went to check on the tent, she found it empty and the men gone. This would seem to indicate that they had left sometime during the night. However, it's possible that whatever made those screams could have been responsible for the camper's disappearance. DNA testing revealed the remains belonged to one of the missing campers, and soon after, investigators announced that they believed the others were dead, too. Was it possible that these 3 friends had decided to leave the area without telling anyone? It didn't seem likely. Not only were the men experienced outdoorsmen, but they wouldn't have left their food and supplies behind. According to her testimony, the men arrived at the campground late in the afternoon and set up camp. They told her they planned to go for a hike the next morning, and asked her to hold on to their car keys. While they were gone in case they needed to leave early, the men went to bed around 10 p.m., and everything seemed normal. Then, around 2 a.m., she was awakened by the sound of screams in the forest. She described them as blood-curdling screams, like nothing I'd ever heard. She assumed they were animal noises, although she couldn't identify what kind of animal would make such a sound. On August 13, 1970, campers Dennis Martin, Thomas T.C. Corcoran Walker had been seen arguing with the men before they disappeared and was known to have a violent temper. However, he had an airtight alibi and several witnesses who could prove he was nowhere near the campsite at the time the men disappeared, so he wasn't considered a suspect for long. And Robert Bob Kedzier set off into the woods near their campsite on an overnight hiking trip. They planned to return the following evening, but the next day came and went without the campers. When the men did not return to their campsite that night, their friends grew concerned and notified authorities. A search party was organized, But despite their best efforts, no trace of the missing campers could be found. Days turned into weeks and the case went cold. The only thing left behind was a collection of clues that seemed to contradict each other and made little sense. The last person to see the three men alive was campground host Cheryl Baskin. As days turned into weeks and the search continued with no results, suspicion began to fall on one campground visitor, Eugene Buckwalker. The forest where the campers disappeared is a vast and desolate place. In 2018, a podcast called Bear Brook was released, but the story doesn't end there. The first piece of evidence comes from Cheryl Baskin, the campground host, who was the last person to see the men alive. At around the same time, a young couple camping nearby also reported hearing screams in the forest. The second piece of evidence is the strange behavior of some of the other campers at the campground. Another camper, Roland Knowles, claimed to have seen a strange car driving slowly through the campground in the early hours of the morning. The third piece of evidence is the most damning of all. While the case remained cold for decades, it was never truly forgotten about. The most tragic part of this story is that the men were so close to being found. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you think the campers were murdered, or did they run into something in the woods that they weren't supposed to see?